Hi there. So I decided to do my project on romance and chivalry. Um, in the beginning of the class, when we first started to do, Yvain, and we started to talk about the different romances, and I was really interested to see how that played on how we depict love today. I'll be using the PowerPoint as I continue to present virtually. Okay, so my thesis is ideas regarding romance and chivalry have changed drastically over the last 800 years, and I believe that they have negatively affected American society today. So, before we get into that, we need to look back at the history. But I started out by defining what romance, chivalry, and courtly love were because they all intertwine. Um, so I went online and I got the dictionary definition of each of these things. So if you look on slide 3, the first thing is what is romance? There are 5 different definitions. I highlighted the words that were kind of stuck out to me. So the first one says a novel or other prose narrative depicting heroic or marvelous deeds, pageantry, romantic exploits, etc. Um, that's going to be one thing that's important later. And then if you look at number 4, it's a completely different definition, which is a baseless, made up story, usually full of exaggeration or fanciful invention. Um, so it's really important to look at the difference in those specific definitions, because then if you go on to the next one, the 5th definition, a romantic spirit, sentiment, emotion, or desire. So that's going to really play a big role in my thesis. So if we go to the next slide, what is chivalry? That's another important one. I thought it was really interesting how chivalry was defined. So the first one says the sum of the ideal qualifications of a knight, including courtesy, generosity, valor, and dexterity in arms. That's going to be really important later when we talk about the originally what a knight was and what the code of chivalry actually was in the beginning, because it's totally different than somebody who is this generous, courteous, or as 5 says, a gentleman, which is also very interesting. Because number 5 on the definition says gallant warriors or gentlemen. Those are, like, in a way, they're kind of different things. So then going on, uh, I began to define courtly love. That was the third thing I needed to find a definition for. So, courtly love says there's one definition: a highly stylized code of behavior popular chiefly from the 12th to the 14th century that prescribed the rules of conduct between lovers, advocating idealized but illicit love, and which fostered an extensive medieval literature based on this tradition. So, this is going to be really, really important. Um, and again, I highlighted the parts that I felt were very important. So, if we look even at the definition, that prescribed the rules of conduct between lovers, advocating idealized but illicit love, which fostered an extensive medieval literature based on this tradition. Um, this is going to go into my thesis where even though there's supposed to be, rules of conduct between lovers, and it was idealized but illicit love, that's going to be really important because as culture has changed, um, we're going to see that, love wasn't particularly the enabling force that brought people together or marriages. It was more or less a contract, but we're going to get into that later. So these definitions are really important to keep in mind moving forward. Um, so the first thing I really wanted to talk about was where the word romance itself, how did romance become about literature that has to do with love? Like, where did that connection come in reference to words? So, romance was originally referred to the vernacular French language. Um, so, it was known as romance, and the spelling is there, Romanz. And romance was the language spoken by the Romans. Since it was spoken by the Romans, they were known as romantic languages, which usually included Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, and French. So I think that's really important to look at, because that's also going to aid in the spread of these uh, types of literature. Romantic literature was not really even considered, it wasn't really considered even literature at the time. The most popular narrative among the French-speaking courts were actually romances. And we're going to get into later why that was. A typical romance had to do with chivalric adventures of knights. And usually these knights included their ladies, and they were often set at the court of King Arthur. When you think of romance, you'd always think of an adventure, or of a knight, or of, you'll think of association with King Arthur, because it's really what romance was. So, in order to understand where romance as literature came from, we have to understand the type of audience that was commissioning these different narrative songs, poems. So the audience itself were women of the court. They're mostly responsible for vernacular narratives, and usually this included the queen, a duchess, a countess, just high-standing aristocratic women. They wanted women to play more of a central role. So if you take a Germanic epic such as Beowulf, it's mostly about male warriors and this, brute force and fighting and war and male bonding, and the women doesn't really play too much of a leading role. So these women wanted to change that. One woman in particular, she greatly influenced the idea of courtly love itself, and that's Eleanor of Aquitaine. So it's kind of important to look at Eleanor of Aquitaine's life. A lot of these things are reflected in the rules of courtly love. She married King Louis of France, and she had 2 daughters with him. Later, their marriage was annulled, but this wasn't until 15 years later. And so she kind of bounced from him, and then in simply 2 months, she married Henry II of England. So Henry II of England was also 9 years younger than she was, and she had 3 daughters with him. That's something that's kind of important to keep in mind, because when we go and actually take a look at the rules of courtly love, or we look at some of the romantic literature, often the knight, or the central male in the romantic narrative, is younger. There are definitely some parallels between Eleanor of Aquitaine and writing of this time period in reference to romantic literature. She brought to the English court her interest in poetry, music, and the arts. Her grandfather, William, was actually one of the first known troubadour poets. So it's really important to look at that aspect also, because a way that romantic songs or poems, a way that they ended up spreading, had to do also with troubadour. Because they would play in the courts. Moving forward, one of the things that's important to understand is the courts of love. A big idea was that Eleanor and her 2 daughters, Marie of Champagne and Isabel of Flanders, they would hold courts of love in France. Nobody really knows if that actually happened. That's just kind of the thought that has been thrown around. But even if it did happen or did not happen, we have the result of it, which was uh, the rules of courtly love. They were formerly written by Andreas Capellanus. I totally massacred that. But he wrote The Art of Courtly Love, or the idealized version of this love. And it's going to play a huge role on characters and on, the psyche of people, but not until 800 years later. So, on the next two slides 12 and 13, I've depicted all the rules of courtly love. I would maybe like put a little star next to them because we're gonna come back to them. Some of the romantic ideas that I wanted to talk about were Shretan de Troyes. I am massacring that too. I'm sorry. I really apologize for the pronunciation of names. It's not going to be good. But he wrote The Knight of the Cart, and that's one of the first romantic narratives where the love of Lancelot and Genevieve, it's first introduced. It's believed that The Knight of the Cart was written and dedicated to Countess Marie of Champagne. Again, a huge influence in reference to the rules of courtly love, with her mother being Eleanor of Aquitaine. Lancelot and Genevieve were the most popular couple in medieval romances. So when anybody would write a narrative about a medieval romance, it was often set in a time where it was King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, and the central lovers were Lancelot and Genevieve. Following those two were Tristan and Iseult. And another thing I wanted to talk about was Guam de Machot. Now we're going to take a look at one of his songs, was a troubadour song. Okay, Foy Porter. If you look at the refrain, even I didn't put the whole song. The words, translated to English, say, I want to stay faithful, guard your honor, seek peace, obey fear, serve and honor you, until death, peerless lady. The ideas of romance, the ideas of this, of courtly love were portrayed very heavily here. Focus shifted from serving his country to serving and honoring his woman. And then he goes on to say, until death, peerless lady. So, I mean, basically, until death. So death do us part. This is like it. I want to serve and honor you until death. And that was 100% a romantic idea. Now, one of the ideas, which I kind of just touched upon, had to do with a knight in a courtly love relationship versus a knight and his liege lord. One of the ideas was that these romances were written to kind of give these young knights something to aspire to be, essentially. So if we compare a knight in a courtly love relationship, he serves his courtly lady with obedience and loyalty. And the lady is typically older, going back, like I said, like Eleanor of Aquitaine is one of those ideas. This woman is married, and usually married to a feudal lord. So it's important to look at that, because knights at this time typically were at a lower social standing. So the lady that he usually had his romance with was of higher social status. Now, if you look at a knight and his liege lord, he treats his liege lord with obedience and loyalty, the same way that instead of, removing the liege lord and replacing it with a woman. Again, there's that typical idea of obedience and loyalty that a knight is supposed to have. They were typically young, again, and they did not own land. So if they didn't own land and they were young and of this lower social status, they were unable to support a wife. So this gave, again, another idea where what they would do is they become members of the household of the feudal lords in whom they served. So that's important to look at. It could use as a model for socially with women. My question was, why a knight? uh, what was it about a knight that they decided to use this big heroic figure in romance literature? It's more understood in, like, Germanic epics, or epics in general. Uh, when you think of a knight, the knight was essentially a warrior. The knight, again, like I said, was motivated not by the idea to serve his country, but he was motivated by the love that he has for his lady. So that's a romantic idea. Um, a knight was typically looked at as a lower class, violent, typically just running around pillaging and plundering and just destruction. And a knight was not looked at as this hero in the sense of being chivalric. And I'm going to use that word with air quotes, chivalric, because we're going to get into the code of chivalry now. It's important to know that the knight's code of chivalry was uh, was not necessarily meant to have anything to do with really women. It was kind of like the oath that these young men were taking, and it often had to do with, you know, fighting and dying with honor and just being this honorable person, and because it was supposed to be a life filled with adventure, and it was very interesting. You worked for the king, and that was really what you knew. Usually had none, really little to nothing to do with women. I pledge to honor and respect and be obedient and loyal to the king and to the country. When romance and knighthood finally became associated with each other, lines became blurred between the original code of chivalry and the meaning of the word chivalry itself. So if you look on slides 21 and 22, the I've included the code of chivalry, what it actually was. So again, even the first code of chivalry lived to serve king and country. That has absolutely nothing to do with living to serve a lady or a woman. So it's interesting to look at. It was just basically, things to live by. Never attack from behind. Protect the innocent. Exhibit self-control. So they're all things that kind of would help in wartime, or while fighting an enemy. One of the questions I also wanted to look at was, why does the romantic knight act the way that he acts? Why are these character traits given to him, aside from, arranging a few things in the code of chivalry? You can give credit to a Latin poet named Ovid. He wrote what would be the symptoms of love. So he described love itself as a sickness, and some of the, I guess you could say, some of the signs of being lovesick, which is a term that we actually use today, were sighing, turning pale, turning red, fever, inability to eat, sleep or drink. These are really, like, extremely exaggerated elements to add to romantic narratives. So one of the things I wanted to look at was why. It's interesting to look at how a marriage contract worked in medieval times. Love was one of the last reasons to get married, whereas if we look at today, it's primarily the biggest reason to marry. Medieval romances, where I like to look at them as today's 50 Shades of Grey. An idea that a lot of women knew that love or their marriage was never going to be that way. So it kind of was like a fantasy in a way for them. At this time, marriage was a social contract. People got married to move up in society or to maintain status. You wouldn't find someone of aristocratic birth marrying a pauper. It just didn't happen. So romantic literature really came out of this time where, you know, people weren't marrying for self-fulfillment or for love. It was marrying more like a business deal than it was to be in love. I think it's also very interesting to look at some of the courting rituals. Of a lot of rituals and ideas were rooted in medieval times. Today's courting rituals, such as buying a woman dinner or opening a door for her, are rooted in medieval chivalry. Um, During medieval times, the importance of love in a relationship, it emerged more or less as a reaction to arranged marriages, but it was still not considered a prerequisite in a matrimonial decision. Again, going back to the idea of, really loving versus being in a business contract as a relationship. One of the things that they would do though was they would kind of try to woo their beloved with serenades and very corny poetry. The idea that romantic love would become viewed as the primary reason or the primary requirement for marriage and courting is when it became more formal in the Victorian era, roughly 1837 to 1901. So the idea was that they had to be formally introduced, and it was also to the point that a gentleman, if a gentleman wished to escort the lady home, he would have to present his card to her. By presenting a card to her, at the end of the evening, the lady would look over her options and choose who would be her escort. So these ideas really resonated, but they didn't really take off until the Victorian era, in which we began to mimic some of these gestures and what it means to court. Getting into part two, the question that I had was, what effect did this have on society 800 years later? One of the things before we get into this I would like you to keep in mind was that a courtly love relationship was typically not between husband and wife. It was typically an affair. It was an idealized sort of relationship. The readers at the time knew that this was not possible, and they knew that this was not something that could actually be entertained as an action, but it was entertaining in the fact of, I guess, the thought of it itself. Audiences of early romantic literature, they were completely aware that this writing was fiction. So, going into my thesis, I believe that these notions of love carried through 800 years later, but now, because love is the primary reason to marry, it affected human behavior because of how it was depicted in romance literature, which now it's going to be even worse in 2014, in the 21st century, because we have social media and we have technology where I'm going to get into some statistics about how many messages are being displayed to us every day, and where these ideas really started to come across and how they're affecting our ability to have a successful and healthy relationship. It's important to look at relevancy. And I think that's important with a lot of things, especially in reference to literature, which is why some people have a hard time understanding literature that was hundreds of years before their time. Well, according to Charles Muscatine, who is a professor, who wrote a book, he wrote that the central problem of the humanities is that of relevance. Are the humanities still relevant? Now, that's something really interesting to look at, and that's one of the things that led to my social experiment, where I wanted to see to what extent, there are perennial truths in medieval romantic literature, because that's also one of the things that he spoke about, where how, relevant or not, they're still studied today and still looked at today because they held perennial truths. Which elements of chivalry and courtly love show perennial truths? which were just meant for the audience in which it was written. Now, throughout time, society has changed along with the culture, which has changed. So, this led me to the first part of my social experiment, where I asked a series of questions to two females and one male in relevance to notions of romance, chivalry, and courtly love. I wanted to see how these ideas have changed or have remained in what I believe to be disillusioned throughout generations. You're going to hear from one male in his early 20s, a female at the age of 11, and a female in her early 40s. I did this for a reason, because I wanted to get, generations. Because this idea of even marrying just for love really only took off in the last 100 years or so. Uh, this really wasn't something that was really thought about either up until the last 100 years. So it's still a relatively new idea. But I wanted to see how that played across the generation gap. Now I'm going to play the video clip for you, and I'll be right back.
When I think of romance, I think of it more of as a behavior, like when someone's being romantic. It shows that they're putting a little extra care. Sometimes it's a little cheesy into someone that they really care about, or someone that they like. You think of the stereotypical like candles, really fancy dinner, roses, chocolates, stuff like that. It could probably extend beyond that, but like when it first comes to my mind, that's what I imagine.
What is romance? Love. I don't know. I don't know what romance is. I'm only 11.
Nice gestures. Mm-hmm. Like flowers or a bottle of wine, or somebody draws a bubble bath for me. And at the end of the day, with some soft music and candles.
Let's think of chivalry as just kind of being decent without any sort of, thought that you're going to get something in return. Like you're doing it for the sake of doing it. Sort of like how someone is honorable for honor's sake.
Good.
Going to a restaurant and sharing a drink with one drink and 2 straws. Open the door for you.
They open the door for you?
Yeah.
Okay, anything else?
And pay for your dinner and your movie.
A chivalrous act is when a gentleman opens the door for me, or he pulls out my seat, or he helps me carry my groceries to the car.
If I'm in love with someone, it's hard to stop thinking about them. If I'm kind of seeing someone, I don't really care. It's really easy kind of detach myself from the thought of them, and things don't really remind me of them. But when I'm really in love with someone, it's constant. Like it's just kind of like a gut feeling, I want to say, and you feel like when they're away, you want to see them again.
They're always together.
Well, first of all, love's more than a feeling. Feelings come and go. But commitment, and understanding one another, and being truly concerned about one another, being truly concerned about another person's well-being. And yeah, it's the feelings, it's the shortness of breath, the tickling in your belly. It's, when you can't smile, you can't stop smiling. It's a permanent smile.
Depends. If, for example, typically, you should pay for stuff, or at least make the offer to pay for it. It's understandable. Let's say you don't have a job, or you don't have that much disposable income. Just be upfront and honest, and at least say that, can we, kind of split this? Can we go Dutch? Be very, comfortable, casual, but just treat them with respect.
Sensitive to her emotions. If she cries in the movie, he shouldn't laugh. And if she wants refills on her drink, he should go get another drink for her.
He should treat her like a gentleman. A gentleman is kind. A gentleman puts a lady first, and he needs to be complimentary, and he needs to be courteous and have manners and be respectful.
I think some are okay, but a lot aren't, because they tend to assume that everyone kind of falls under the same generalities of rules. Relationship can't exist without jealousy. I don't think that's necessarily true. I think, yeah, there is some sort of attachment, and that can lead to jealousy if someone else tries to, if you're seeing a girl and she's talking to someone more than you, you're probably going to feel a little jealous. But I think jealousy is a weird word to use. I think, yeah, you can feel that attachment and sort of that, like, a sense of envy when they're not with you all the time, but you need to control that. And if jealousy is a weird thing because you can easily be overcome by it, and it can turn into a negative rather than just I like being around you.
This one I really like.
What is it?
No one should be deprived of love. Everyone should be able to get married and have a boyfriend or something. I think that a man should go to work, and the woman should be like a mom. Well, not she has kids, but she should clean the house and take care of him and cook. She could also have a job, but I think that a woman should come back and take care of him and cook for him and clean stuff.
Okay.
I think the main thing is that everyone deserves to be loved. It's very important to not have an envious jealousy that's going to hinder your relationship. I think that hurts a relationship. It doesn't help it. I just do believe that everybody is entitled to love, and I do think that love does give you those ultimate feelings of euphoria.
A big, strong man fights for a princess.
Well, if you think in terms of Cinderella, or you think in terms of Disney, a knight in shining armor, it's somebody who's totally in love with you and who thinks you are the center of his world, and he sweeps you off of your feet.
I think as time progressed, we lost that because love turned more into the focus was shifted from attachment and from duty and from chivalry onto just kind of focusing on the physical aspects of love. And I don't know, really. I think with regards to culture, we kind of glamorize it because we kind of miss it in a way. But in our day-to-day actions, I don't see it too often.
Yes, I know that. I know that people still do look for that, because my mom, like, when she watches a movie like that, she always says, I wish I could find someone like that, and I wish my relationship could be like that, and it could end up perfect at the end.
I definitely believe that the media, television, and film and television play a huge role in what people perceive love to be. For example, soap operas. They think that love is just this this very cavalier, easygoing. Everything's about getting up every day and just putting on your makeup and your hair and getting dressed and just spending the day walking through the grass. And it's just not love.
One of the things I was looking for was talking about the rules of courtly love and the code of chivalry, and I wanted to see which aspects really played a part in the thinking of three different generations of people. After watching that, I thought that all three participants had disillusioned ideas as to what romance was and what chivalry was, and all three of them have referenced things straight out of the code of chivalry or straight out of the rules of courtly love. So now the idea was to try to distinguish which of these things were ideas that have been portrayed for centuries through fictitious literature, and which of these things had the perennial truths. And I also administered a paper survey where I surveyed 10 males and 10 females ages 18 to 22. Now the statistics of that were 90% did not know what chivalry actually was. And 100% agreed that no one should be deprived of love. So I think that proves, and you even heard in the verbal testimonies, that the idea of what romance and chivalry really are have been heavily influenced by romantic literature. The fact that 100% of participants agreed that no one should be deprived of love, which is straight from the rules of courtly love, I found that to be a perennial truth. Now, one of the issues is with this romantic literature and with this shift in culture, um, why is this a problem if it's taken seriously? I feel that, for example, the art of courtly love, you can break up you could break up, groupings of the rules into different categories, such as obsession. Um, Many described suffering, jealousy, depression, desperation. These are all very negative aspects to describe, well, something that's depicted of as such a great feeling, such as love. Um, so I believe that that's a real problem. That if these ideas are portrayed, that people are going to look for something that doesn't exist and was never meant to exist. And romantic literature, or today, I like to look more at romantic comedies in particular. They don't really tell you what happens after the big kiss. Um, and I think that's a problem. And I feel that that is going to leave people's ideas of what love and romance is meant to be. Um, it's going to leave it very disillusioned. According to an article in the New York Times, some historians consider romantic love to be a learned behavior that really took off in the late 18th century, along with the new fashion of reading novels. Um, Although, even then, affection between a husband and wife was considered to be in questionable taste. The fact that historians consider romantic love to be a learned behavior is going to be really the crux of a problem that we are faced with today in the 21st century. Jumping back, this is so important that marriages were not based on love in that time period. Um, and now that love is the biggest factor in relationships, it has become overemphasized. Now, the cultural shift caused more recent generations to look to movies, songs, novels, in order to shape their ideas about what love and romance really is. This is going to lead to a very disheartening statistic that roughly 50% of all marriages end in divorce. I believe that has a lot to do with, again, our disillusioned idea as to what love really is. The average American takes in 3,500 to 5,000 marketing messages per day. And they spend roughly 41 hours per week using technology such as cell phones, TV, video games. And that's really important because in those 3,500 to 5,000 marketing messages, not only are you getting, oh, you're supposed to look this way, or you're supposed to act this way, or think this way, but you're also getting ideas about what love is. Um, so the media portrays this idea of a perfect love. Because people base marriages and try to base their love off of what the media tells them it should be. I looked into some studies, and there were two studies that I looked into. One, Harriet Watt University's Family and Personal Relationships Laboratory, and then the Barna Group, and then there's two testimonies, and a general idea of love. And one comes from Reed Datzman, who has a PhD in psychology, and another is from Shannon Martin, who is just a housewife. The first study that I would like to talk about was the one by the Harriet Watt University's Family and Personal Relationships Lab. What they did was they studied 40 Hollywood romantic comedies, or in today's lingo, they're known as rom-coms, romantic comedies. They studied 40 of them that were released between 1995 and 2005, so this 10-year period. So they found that some problems that were typically reported by couples in relationship counseling um, at the counseling center that the university has, they found that a lot of them reflect on misconceptions about love that are portrayed in Hollywood films. So, going back to this idea of this perfect love that is portrayed in the media today, again, this is a big, very big parasite. Um, Around 130 students who volunteered, um, they watched the 2001 romantic comedy called Serendipity. Another group was taken and they were to watch a David Lynch drama. So, you have a romantic comedy and then you have somebody else, another group watching a drama. Um, Now, between the two, they found that viewers of the romantic comedy were found to be more likely to believe in fate and destiny. It's going to lead to some issues later, and that's where I get into the testimonies that I found. Dr. Reed Deitzman, who said, "A real relationship is one where you take out the garbage, pay the bills, and talk to your kids." It doesn't sound anything like a romantic comedy. It sounds not. There's no element of a man dying for honor or a man fighting for honor's sake of the woman. There's none of that. It's just very simple and trivial. She says that a lot of it is really boring in relationships. A lot is boring. There's no, I'm coming to save the day, and you're the center of my world. It's not that. Now, she says what people don't realize though is that the best day of their lives includes all that boring stuff. She goes on to say, because when people don't have it, they really miss it. She said a guy who just had an affair really misses his wife and would love to be back with her talking about trivial things. So, and then, this also brings up the issue where there's people who, maybe go out of that love relationship of a marriage and they try to go on to seek other things, and a lot of times affairs happen. And if we go take a look back, what was that idea of courtly love? The art of courtly love was between two people who usually were not married. Just to make a little connection there. Love is portrayed in the media as this very desirable thing than what is actually experienced in reality. A testimony by Sharon Martin, who's just a young married mom from Connecticut. So her quote exactly was, "Romantic movies make you think your relationship is supposed to be so amazing, passionate, and exciting all the time. My marriage isn't like that, and sometimes I wonder if something's wrong." There's the parasite. Just because something is being portrayed one way to you, whether it's through a novel or through a movie or through radio or any kind of subliminal messaging, doesn't mean that it's true. This goes back to 800 years prior, when at least the audience knew this to be fictitious. Now, we know sometimes we believe, yeah, we know that it's not real and it can never happen that way. But for some reason, many of us tend to look for it. Another study that was done by a group called the Barna Group, and they did a study on divorce. Now, their study confirms that ideas about love and marriage are definitely changing. And this makes a difference. Now, what they had done was interviews with young adults. They suggest that they want their initial marriage to last, but are not particularly optimistic about that possibility. They say that there is also evidence that many young people are moving toward embracing the idea of serial marriage, so in which a person gets married 2 or 3 times. That tells you something right there. Back then, the idea, if you were to really break apart from somebody, it was a big thing. It wasn't just, oh, it's so easy to get a divorce. That wasn't necessarily the case. A lot of the times, it was, we were together until I become a widow. in reference to a woman. Um, and often a woman was able to remarry um, in medieval times, and but there was like a certain period of time that was socially accepted that you weren't to marry for a certain amount of time. Now, if you look at the Art of Courtly Love, it says after 2 years, but if you look at Eleanor of Aquitaine, it was 2 months. So again, a little bit of like a hypocritical notion. In reference to my thesis, that literature and were meant to be idealized, especially in romance, was meant to be an idealized version of what love was to be. That basis, even 800 years ago, has really infected the minds of people in writing and thoughts about love today. Look to model their relationships after what is portrayed to them. And this is a very dangerous mix, as you can see with the statistics of divorce and with the outlook of young people on marriage. Not everything is meant to be taken seriously. Some things are just meant as fantasy. So I've also that really proves that you know as a culture, our society is changing. Love is now, you know, pretty much the primary reason in which people come together and people marry. It's not how it was then. So those ideals and ideas of what it means to be romantic and what it means to be chivalrous and what it means to love, they aren't looked at the same way that they were when they were written. Well, that's it. If you have any questions for me, feel free to email me. The citations are located at the end of the PowerPoint, and I hope you enjoyed my presentation, and I also hope you enjoy your summer. Thanks.